All right, welcome back. We are going to hit the ground running. Quick note, if you've seen the announcements on Canvas, so I've come up with what I think is a very nice way of solving the pop quiz extra credit assignment dilemma conundrum. So next week, around exactly a week from now, we'll be here, and we'll have a guest lecture by Professor Eric Mack, who's professor of philosophy at Tulane. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that he's sort of the main defender of sort of roughly Nozick's way of thinking about political philosophy alive today. He even studied with Nozick himself for a little while. And so Professor Mack shared with me a piece that he wrote, which is supposed to be a little more, supposed to be a fairly accessible piece, where he defends something like Nozick's theory of rights, and he's going to give a talk on that, which deals with the issues that we'll be talking about today and Tuesday, actually. So questions about what Nozick calls side constraints, rights, self-ownership, and how that relates to, for example, Rawls's theory of justice. So I've put that reading online. The reading is like a normal journal article length. So I've selected a couple of sections that you want to, if you don't want to read the whole thing, just focus on those sections that I've listed on the syllabus and in the announcement. The whole thing is very much worth reading, but that's the core. And then I'll post a short essay question for you to do on Canvas. Now, we were supposed to have our exam in class next week, so I've moved that one online. So we'll see how that goes. Basically, the thing will be the same as normal, right? So you can, well, obviously you can use your notes and your books and stuff. The thing will be it'll come online for, I think I said Thursday and Friday. I might extend that a little longer, maybe throughout the weekend to give you a little more flexibility. But in any case, the point would be, once you open that thing on Canvas, you have 75 minutes to complete it. And then you'll get multiple choice questions through Canvas. You just click on the answer that you think is right. And then there will be a text box like with the essay thing where you just submit your essay question. You'll be just like those people that are with us through the video thing. All right, so here's where we picked up last time. I had to rush through right at the end, so I'm going to do quickly finishing our discussion of Locke's argument of property, and then on to Nozick and Cohen, which will be the final topic of the term. There it is. So, all right, what we said. Remember, Locke is giving us a theory of appropriation. That theory has a role, right? Has a point. The point Locke is trying to make is, look, I can show you, bless you. I can show you, Locke says, why even in a state of nature, before any government is created, any real complicated civil society or whatever has arisen, I can show you why people should be treated as if they have private ownership. And by private ownership, he means rights to exclude others from material goods. Pieces of land, food, animals even. And the argument he gives has to do with labor mixing. Right? He thinks when you mix your labor with it, the thing that is unowned, you become the owner. And we saw that there is a literal way of reading that. Really, he thinks, why would that be the case? Well, because you mix your labor which you own with something that's unowned. That's the most popular reading. But then again, he also takes a pretty light reading of what it takes to mix your labor with it. Like picking up the acorn itself would be enough. So there was another argument that we saw where he's just he's making a line drawing argument where it says the only sensible way to identify where property might begin is where you do something you interact with the external world in some way that's labor-like or productive. All right. That's the heart of the theory. Locke has a couple of qualifications or limits on the theory. One limit or one qualification is you cannot take more than you can effectively use. Or negatively speaking, you cannot take so much that you let it spoil or waste. So in a state of nature, way back when, so like before we have civil society and it's just us sort of roaming around in the jungle or something, right? You can only take so many, like all you're gathering is fruits and berries and roots and stuff. You can only gather so much as you actually need to eat, or you can store and eat until it goes off. Right? Today we can take a little more probably of food, stuff like that, because we have refrigerators and freezers and stuff, right? So you can keep things a lot longer before they spoil. But he says even stronger, we can actually amass now way bigger possessions. People can become very, very rich because we actually put a lot of value in things that don't spoil at all, which is your fine metals, right? So gold in particular. And so gold don't rust, right? So you can keep that as much gold as you want. Today, of course, we have numbers on an electrical account. They never go off, right? So no problem at all, he thinks. With that, in that regard, there's no spoilage or wasting worry about having a lot of money. The other one, this is where we left off. The other one is, Locke says, in the state of nature, you can appropriate as long as you leave for others enough and as good. Enough and as good as you had available. Or enough and as good in common, he sometimes says. This became a really controversial or big issue in political philosophy. What exactly does Locke mean with enough and as good? Why would it help justify property? And what is the implications? So Nozick, you'll have seen, Nozick famously says, enough and as good just means enough and as good as people had before property got started. So way back in the state of nature. So what Locke basically says, Nozick is claiming, Nozick is proposing, Nozick says, here's what Locke is after. Locke thinks it would be a problem if people started appropriating things in the state of nature and they made you worse off by it. But if they don't make you any worse off, or maybe even make you better off, then there is no problem at all and they can just appropriate away. And so Nozick thinks that actually that's a demand that we can sort of pose on a property system all the way up into the future. So he talks about the historical shadow of the Lockean proviso. So he has these thought experiments. Suppose that we live in a desert and we have these water holes. Everyone has their own water hole. Everyone's water hole dries up except mine. I own mine, but now you're way worse off than you were if there were no property. Because if there were no property, you could use my water hole. Now I'm the owner. You can't. So you're worse off. He thinks that limits what I can do with it.
Could that example that you just put forward right here be used as like this might be a little bit off, but justification for, say, immigration? Like the wormhole.
Can you explain?
Like, okay, so if someone will be worse off by you restricting their freedom of movement because, let's say, their proverbial water hole being the other country is a country in which there's a lot of strife, terrorism, what have you, and them controlling themselves, exercising their liberty to move elsewhere for a better shot at life to a broader water hole, would that be an argument to say that you should not restrict that person's freedom of movement? So,
yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. So you might think that immigration limits or restrictions violate something like the Lockean proviso. That's the idea. Yeah, maybe that's interesting. There's a question about whether these are ownership claims, right? But yeah, they're exclusion claims, so it's close enough probably. Yeah, that's interesting. Now, by the way, we'll see in a second, most people who don't like what Nozick has to say, but this will work for you nicely probably. Like Cohen famously attacked Nozick on this, and they think that not making people any worse off than they would be way back when in sort of like caveman era. That's a really low bar to clear, right? Like, it's not saying, if that's supposed to be your big story about why this whole property or capitalistic society is justified, it's not the strongest story probably. Well, of course, that helps. Well, if you wanted to say if you wanted to use that argument for defending something like opening the borders, that's good news for the argument, right? Because you can say, look, even if it is a way too low, we owe people way more, they don't even satisfy that, right? So that could, yeah, that's rhetorically probably a good move. All right, here's how Locke goes about it, right? Locke thinks if enough and as good is left, then property is justified. Why? Well, here he says, like, he that has enough and is good, or he that has as good left for his improvement. So if you can acquire, there's a lot of unappropriated stuff lying around, you can go and appropriate that yourself. So that's you, the he, right? He that has a lot, you have enough left for your own improvement, as was already taken up, as I have, right? You have no standing to complain. You ought not to meddle with me, my stuff that I already improved by my labor. And if you did, right, 'tis plain he desired the benefit of another's pains, which he had no right to. So that's the labor mixing story coming back, right? Locke says, look, there is this piece of land that I've made more valuable. We're working on it. There's a lot of stuff out there that you can use yourself. If you say to me, like, I don't want the other stuff, I want this stuff, you're really coming after my work, not coming after that piece of land. Because there's plenty of other land around, right? Like, why do you want this lot? Well, because of what I did to it. But that's, you're coming. And now, this wrong because you have no right to the pains that are under them, my body, myself. And so here you can see in Locke the basic grain, or the basic kernel of Nozick's idea that taxation is forced labor. Right? It's you coming in and trying to take my work, my body, my energy from me. All right. So, all right. Quickly, that was way back when, right? And then later we talked about this. Locke says even right now, when there is not a lot of stuff unimproved, unowned stuff lying around, you don't really have to worry because living standards go up because of the increased efficiency and productivity. So we actually produce more that's available for others. He's really talking here about the state of nature, where things are just lying still in common. But most people, including Nozick, nowadays think that you can extend this even further and say, well, it's not just in a state of nature where there's enough left because of increased efficiency in common, but there's just enough left. There's a lot now just to own. Even if it's not in common, it's there to own. You can acquire things. Working for it, giving it, earning it, all sorts of ways. And that'll do, right? All right. We'll talk about this. So, the last thing in Locke. There's a lot of criticism of Locke's argument. We've seen a bunch already last time. We saw arguments against the labor theory. That's the next slide, but I won't bother you with it because we've talked about it in detail. There's also a lot of criticism of the enough and is good stuff. Here is the first one that people have made, the criticism of enough and is good in Locke. Think about it this way. People say, well, can you ever appropriate and leave enough and as good? Especially if you start putting a lot of emphasis on as good, right? Well, maybe not, right? And Nozick himself actually raises this worry in the so-called zipping back argument. It's not as good because, well, I acquired this lot here, right? And before I did that, you had available the opportunity to acquire this lot here. It's probably a nice lot, that's why I chose it, right? And now I acquired it, and now you don't have that opportunity anymore. So what you have left might be enough, but it's not as good. Right? As good would have meant you could still get to own it. And so Nozick has this zipping back argument, which he says this is a more sophisticated version of the same worry, but it's saying, well, think about it. Think about the last person who owned, so now, let's say there's 100 pieces of land that we can own, right? 99 pieces have been appropriated, and now I come and I appropriate number 100. The last one, right? So, okay, do I leave enough and is good? Well, no, right? Because there's nothing left. Okay, well, that means that I cannot appropriate, right? Well, if I cannot appropriate, that means that number 99 before me didn't leave enough and is good for me, right? Because that person appropriating lot number 99 made it impossible for me to appropriate lot 100 because I would thereby make it impossible for you to appropriate full stop. Okay, well that means number 99 did not leave enough and is good, and that means number 99 cannot appropriate. And so number 98 now doesn't leave number 99 enough and is good, and so on, right? And that's the zipping back. The whole thing zips back to the very first one. The very first person cannot appropriate because they won't leave enough and is good for others. Because if one does it, then two cannot appropriate anymore. Right? Because if 2 does it, then 3 cannot appropriate it more. Because if 3 does it, then 4 cannot appropriate it more. Blah, 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 all the way to the point to where I am number 100. If I do it, you cannot appropriate anymore. And so Nozick thinks this is a problem. Well, we'll get to this. Nozick thinks.
I mean, so is the main difference that just Nozick presumes this is a zero-sum game versus like Locke, or does Locke think it's zero? I mean, that's what it sounds like.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I think what Nozick is saying, this is Nozick's point, I think. Nozick is saying that if you conceive of appropriation or the enough is good clause in zero-sum terms, this blows up the whole theory, right? So, in plain language, what does he mean? He says, well, like if you look at it, appropriating land is a zero-sum game. Right? I mean, you take a piece of land away, even though Locke says, well, use is not zero-sum, right? Because you can use things more efficiently or less efficiency, and if you appropriate it and become more efficient at it, the value of the land increases. But the actual physical, the spatial extension of the land, that is zero-sum. So at some point, there's no land left, right? And so Nozick, I think, is saying, these type of objections are kind of silly because they mean if we take enough and is good to mean like spatially there has to be enough and is good, well then it won't work, right? So that can't be what the argument is about. What Locke has in mind has to be something more about the value or the use of it. And then Nozick says, well, okay, but that can be done within society where everything is owned as well as outside. Because if the availability of unowned stuff is required, then nobody can ever appropriate anything by the zipping back argument. And so then Nozick says, well, but like look around us, look at what the market has done, this property system, it's created tremendous wealth for everyone, so you're way better off than you would be. And Locke thought this too, right? Locke says the day laborer in London is better off than the king in the Indian territories, or something along those lines. Yeah, so some people have said, look, the enough and is good proviso actually prohibits any type of argument, any type of appropriation. And Nozick himself saw it, but I think what Nozick is suggesting is, says, and therefore you shouldn't interpret the proviso that way. It's a dumb reading. So here's a more serious reading. Question is, will in a society with property, this is this thing that Cohen, for example, we'll see likes to make a big deal out of. Will a society with property, that's a society like ours, right, actually leave enough and is good for everyone? I think this maybe is what Will had in mind last time, saying, well, in a society like ours, some people have very, very little. And they don't have land available that they could just go out and appropriate, right? You can't tell them, well, move west. There's stuff that nobody owns, and you can just go there and stake your claim, make something of it. You can't do that anymore, right? So one way that people like Cohen sometimes go against this and say, well, the property system excludes some people to their serious detriment, and then if you take enough and is good very seriously, then you might think, well, those people fall below what enough and is good would require, and so that's a problem. The question to ask is whether that's due to the property system or due to some other reason. At whose feet do you lay this? But that's an objection. All right. So Nozick says no worsening, right? Like making no worse off. Again, the same worry like here can appear, right? Do you think that's good enough? Is it good enough that is it a good enough story to tell on behalf of the property system or the capitalist economy that just people aren't made any worse off than they would have been way back in the day when there was no property at all? It's not a very high bar to clear. Of course, we know that Rawls thinks much more is required, right? Rawls thinks that you have to make sure not just that the worst off are not worse off than they would have been as cavemen, but you have to make sure that the worst off are well off as they can possibly be. That's perhaps the most extreme deviation from this. But even if you don't go with Rawls, you might think, well, that's not good enough of a story to tell. Here's Cohen's most famous objection. So if Nozick tells us appropriation is okay if people are if it makes people no worse off. And Cohen asks, well, compared to what? Right? Nozick says compared to the pre-appropriation stage, right? Like the world without property. Well, Cohen comes back, why is that the relevant comparison? Here's another way. Maybe if we lived in a Rawlsian society instead of a Nozickian society, the people on the bottom would do better because the difference principle tells us they have to do better. Why don't we compare it to that? Right? Why isn't it leaving enough and is good compared to not way back when, but before we got any system like this system going? But why don't we compare it to whatever alternative systems we might have created? Right? We went on one path, the capitalist path, said Cohen. But that's not the only path we could have gone down. We could have gone through a variety of alternatives. And so when Nozick says the capitalist path is the right path to go down, why? Because you're no worse off than you would have been if we hadn't gone down any path whatsoever. Cohen says that's not the right comparison. We should ask which of the paths that we can take is the best one to take. There was a version of that, by the way, that also explodes the whole theory. Of course, there is for any system, it's possible to come up with someone who was worse off than they would be under an alternative system. Right? So think about the following rule. Let's keep the society as we have it today, except we have a rule that says everyone gets taxed 10% of their annual income on behalf of me. Right? I'm way better off under and that's true under any society that I would be better off, right? Of course, ridiculous to say that justice requires that for me. But of course, it's true for me, it's true for you, it's true. Even under that society where I get everything, you could have been better off if we had the same rule for you, right? We can't have the rule for everybody, so it's going to be true for every society that there's going to be some society with comparison to which we do worse, right? At least in theory. And so Cohen says, well, okay, this just means that the proviso cannot be satisfied, right? It's impossible for any society to satisfy the proviso, and so the proviso is bullshit, which means Nozick's theory is bullshit, means Locke's theory, let's get rid of this whole thing. Right? That's how Cohen goes, more or less, about this.
Not to go too off track, but it does kind of remind me of the saying that it's like, yeah, democracy is, like, I think Churchill said it, that like, democracy is the best form of government.
The worst.
Or the worst, besides all the others, yeah.
Right,
and
right.
so it's like, well, what does that say? I mean, how many different types of rule systems have we not tried, I guess? That's kind of curious too.
Yeah, right. So the way to respond perhaps to Cohen's theory is you got to contract the relevant comparison class. Right? You got to say that some comparisons are fair to make, and if you fail those comparisons, it's a problem. And other comparisons, like the gimmicky one that I just proposed, right, are not fair ones to make, and if your society doesn't satisfy that one, big deal. That, of course, is difficult to figure out exactly what the relevant comparison class is. But in any case, even if you can make an argument like that, notice that we're responding to Cohen's initial worry, right? Cohen said Nozick is choosing an arbitrary baseline, which is the one, by the way, that's the easiest for him to satisfy. Because even if people are really poor, like Locke says, the day laborer, who might live a really crappy existence in London at that time. You don't need to read a lot of Dickens to know that that was not a great life, right? So even that person sort of swimmingly passes enough in this good proviso. And Cohen says, well, it's not clear that we're comparing it with the right thing if those people sort of breeze past the post. All right, that was quick. Well, not that quick. I was trying to be quick. Any questions before we go on?
Okay. So, just kind of recapping, so what Cohen is saying is that Nozick's interpretation is not good, and therefore Locke's interpretation is not good.
More or less, yeah. I mean, yeah, for now that's fine, yeah. Locke says property, like the justification of property hinges upon people being left enough and is good. That's what the text suggests, right? And Nozick gives us an interpretation. It says enough and is good means leaving people no worse off than they would have been. And Cohen's response is, why no worse off than they would have been? Why not no worse off than they could be, right? And could be in what kind of society? If justice requires property rights or capitalism as Nozick things, then we should be, Cohen responds, we should be comparing it to the relevant alternatives. And Cohen thinks under socialism, workers will do much better. At least so he claims, right? And that should matter, right? But Nozick says, no, it only matters how the cavemen did. And that's an unfair comparison that Cohen thinks. Yeah, Will? No.
So what does enough mean? Like, if it's enough and as good, doesn't that mean that, well, before like we make our decision of like what path we're going to follow, does that mean that, well, we don't have enough, so why are we taking a path?
Yeah, that's good. It's a good question. Well, there's several good points in there. One point is where you might wonder why people start appropriating at all if there is enough around in the first place, right? Like if we have enough to live on growing on the trees, why would we start owning it? And so so Grotius, for example, interestingly, a contemporary of Locke, Grotius tells a very different story. He says property rights don't get started in an age of abundance because there's enough. Instead, property rights get going when we run out of stuff. So that's when he started. And he thinks that's the only time you're justified in excluding people is when there is not enough to go around. Interesting claim. Hume, of course, thinks somewhat the same, right? The circumstances of justice stuff is about there's not enough for all of us to go around, and that's why we need property rights. So it's a very different, it's a good point. It's a very different story that Locke is telling. One worry, you might also want, Cohen in his, it's a different chapter from the one that we're reading, his criticisms of the enough and as good. But Cohen also says, well, if we have as good already, then why is the enough added, right? Like as good seems to be, well, like no worse off than you were before property. So what's the enough doing?
When I was thinking notes, I said I wrote or just because that seems like it would make more sense.
Yeah. Yeah, Cohen interprets it as follows, as he probably would, because it suits his view. But Cohen thinks that this shows that Locke holds something like the following view, which is if there is not enough to go around, in way back when or today, then we owe it to others to make sure that they have enough. So we should work for them to get them up to the level enough. And then if you're over enough, if we happen to live in a world in which there is more than enough, right, then property rights cannot make it the case that you go from more than enough to just enough, for example. Right? But Locke doesn't say. He just throws out enough and is good, and you never.
I'm just curious if like that was better defined.
Right. No.
Okay.
That's why there's an industry of literature on this. Like if you want to create an industry of literature, come up with a brilliant theory, then throw a couple of completely unexplained sentences in there, and then you get all these people writing about like what the heck does that mean, and then they pump it up into an industry. You get idiots like me writing. I actually do write on the enough and is good proviso. So, Cameron, no.
So it's almost like Cohen's whole thing that he attacked was this particular passage because it needed to be, in his mind, it needed to be salvaged by Nozick's interpretation of the Lockean proviso. He said, okay, so Locke threw away part of his theory on something that needed to be salvaged by a contemporary writer, and their attempt at salvaging was not good. Therefore, the whole entire theory of Locke for this whole idea of appropriation is not good because even the attempt to save it was not sufficient.
Yeah, so there's no way to save it, right? That's the idea. So, I mean, the idea is, like Nozick says, justice consists of really two principles and one remedial principle, right? Just transfer, which means if I can own my things now, I can own this bag, if I bought it legitimately from someone who was the previous legitimate owner, who got it who put it together, right, with materials that they got from their previous owners, all the way back to the very first owner, right? How did they get it? Second principle, right? Justice in acquisition. All right, well, there we are, right? That's what Locke is telling us. Justice in acquisition looks like this. Labor mixing, if enough and as good is left for others. And then that turns out to be a big problem, because what does that mean? Right? If it means like what Nozick says, which is enough and as good left for others at the time of appropriation, well, that's an arbitrary comparison. But there seems to be no non-arbitrary comparison, because you could always come up with a society in which some people do better. And so this whole theory about justice in acquisition doesn't work, because there's no... It looks like we need some comparison, right? Like you can't just say appropriate away and no matter, like, other people be damned. Even Locke doesn't think that. Nozick doesn't think that. So they accept that other people have some claims to the earth and to what we do with it. Okay, what would those claims be? Well, if we start unilaterally appropriating, we can't make sense of what those claims are going to be. So better, we need a system that's different from people just unilaterally appropriating. And Cohen thinks this shows that what is unilaterally appropriating? It's doing things that let you exclude others, right? And Cohen thinks that's where the problem lies ultimately. You just can't you can't justify this excluding business. Hence, socialism. So, 'cause socialism, you don't get to exclude others. Was he? Someone had a hand. Yeah, someone here had a hand up. Okay.
I know we're talking a lot about appropriation right now, but and maybe we're going to touch on this later, so I don't know if this is like a appropriate question right now, but does Nozick, Cohen, or Locke talk about justice and the right to property once you already have that property and how you treat that property? Does that make sense? So like, if you
Yeah, it's interesting.
you have the right to the property, and then maybe you do something that would be, in someone's interpretation, unjust, and then perhaps that affects your ability to have the rights to that property. Do they talk about that?
Not really. Nozick talks a little bit about, in a part of the book that we don't read, he talks a little bit about ways in which you can use, it's obvious that you cannot use your property to damage or destroy another person's property or hurt that person or something, right? Like I can't stab you with my knife, and then if you start complaining, say, well, this is my knife, I get to choose how I use it, right? So it doesn't work that way, right? Because your rights block certain uses of my rights. That's why he calls, Nozick calls rights side constraints. We'll get to that. But then there's, of course, the other things where you don't use... So Nozick is a fairly detailed discussion about... you get quite complicated questions about... Like knife stabbing is an easy case, right? But there are very difficult cases about, like, say, pollution or something, right? So you have a factory in which you burn things, right? And then you put a chimney up in the air, and then these particles sort of float into the air. And they might land on other people's property. Now, maybe sometimes these are like invisible small little particles. Don't really make a difference. But they might stain your car, or they might ruin your crops or something, right? Or worse, they might just impose a risk of these things happening, and then sometimes they do happen and sometimes they don't. And so that gets really complicated really quickly, right? And so he does discuss those things. Quickly, last thing. So one thing they don't discuss, but what is an interesting question, is you might even think, like, are there limits to what we can do with our property when it doesn't affect others at all, right? So this is my favorite example. Suppose you own the Mona Lisa, right? If I own a replica, like just a print, right, of the Mona Lisa, and I'm bored with it, I can take it down in the bin, right? But with the actual Mona Lisa, first of all, it would be retarded, because it'd be like, it's millions, perhaps billions of dollars worth of money, right? But so it would be really stupid for me to do it. But hey, sometimes people do stupid stuff, you know. Whatever. They paint their cars pink or whatever. So that's, not good for the car's value, but they do it anyway. So here's the real Mona Lisa, and I just think, enough. Maybe I'm cold. Let's put it in the stove, or like burn it up or something. And you might think, well, wait a minute. No, that's wrong. Right? Even though it's your property, that's wrong. There's not much written about this. Some people write about things called rights to do wrong. Just the idea that you might have a right, and that the right enables you to do things that are nevertheless wrong. But even that usually comes with some limits. Generally speaking, most people like Nozick think that if you own something, you get to decide what happens to it. So that would include a right to destroy it. And that's very useful, right? Because if you own, say, firewood, right? Like, you want to put it in your stove and destroy the firewood by burning it, right? Like that's that's actually using it. And if you have this replica of the Mona Lisa and you're bored with it, you want to just throw it away and crumble it up. That's destroying it. It's very useful. But there might be cases where that's too much. Right? Or you might own a part, like a big piece of nature that has a lot of wildlife in it or something. And if you start just cutting down the trees, you kill all the wildlife, and it might not be. So, but there's not a lot of, no, maybe there is, and I don't know about it, but I couldn't point you to it.
It seems like that would be a topic that a lot of people would write on, because it seems like that's such a big issue now, where it's like, okay, well, this is my stuff, and like I can do whatever I want to do with my stuff, even if to the outside world it seems like. I think like earlier in this semester, I was talking about there's like some gun owner shop, or a gun shop where the
Mhm.
decided to deny selling guns to any Muslims, and then they took it to the Supreme Court. So like, that was his stuff, and that was his shop, and that's his property that he appropriated. And then what he does with it, regardless of the population sees that as just or unjust, that doesn't matter, I guess, because that's his.
Yeah, so those things aren't typically discussed. I mean, if you think about the Civil Rights Act, for example, that poses several of these limitations on it. Right? So you can't post a sign anymore that says blacks won't be served in this establishment. Right? That's, of course, on your property. And it's not clear how these things go, right? If you have a birthday party and you decide not to invite any black people, the law is not going to interfere, right? Say, like, black people get to show up to your birthday party. No, they don't, because you don't. You get to decide who you do. Now, be a crummy, show that you're a crummy person, and so like we all know that, right? But the law is not going to. It's not a business. But then if you have a shop, different story.
Because it's like under the, even though you appropriated that shop is still technically property of the government, and it's just like how to like, because the government.
No, yeah, usually that's not how they go. It's not, but yeah. Anyway, don't want to get too far into the weeds here. The idea is usually that there's some type of public dimension to the shop that is not to your birthday party.
Public accommodation.
And so, yeah, and so that's why these type of laws get our hooks into stores, but not into birthday parties. So but yeah, that's generally is a broadly discussed topic about where and why you might have these type of limitations about what you can do with what is yours. Yeah. Alan?
So Locke is against waste.
Yes, very much. Yeah, thinks that's an affront to God.
Yeah, and Nozick is not opposed to that. So if I own like a box of apples, it's my apples. There's other apples, but these are my apples.
Just let them waste.
And I can just let them sit and rot, and there's nothing wrong with
He
it.
doesn't say, to my knowledge anyway. If I were to guess, right? If I were to guess, it's a good point because it comes to the same issue, right? Which is like, can you do whatever you want with your property? Locke clearly thinks no, because you can't let it spoil. Then it's no longer your property. If I were to guess, I think Nozick would let that happen. As long as people are no worse off because of it, then
This is my apples.
no worse. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so also about these like civil rights types act, like people like Nozick usually. You never know with Nozick himself because he's such a mercurial thinker. You never know which way he's going to go. But people who follow Nozick often think that things like the Civil Rights Act are problematic. Not because they hate black people, but because they take freedom of contract very seriously. So, like, remember the slogan in Nozick? It's capitalist act between consenting adults. They take the consenting part really seriously, right? Like, if people have a right over it, and their will gets to settle what happens to it. And these laws, they chip away at that. So various forms of labor market regulations, they don't like because it inhibits freedom of contract. Right? So things like the minimum wage laws, they don't like for that reason. Maximum hours per week for like regulations, they don't like that stuff. And so because they think, well, the worker and the employer and the employee should be free to set their own terms. By mutual agreement. If there's coercion involved, different story, right? But if it's just by mutual agreement, then it's nobody else's business.
Well, it seems related to what you were saying about the birthday party. Like, if the person said that, like, no black people allowed, it would indicate they're a crummy person and then allow you to act like there. Like from that point on, you can make decisions based on that. And I had never considered it before, but my friend pointed out, like in a way, by the government protecting businesses that might otherwise make racist decisions, it's kind of protecting them in some ways. That, I don't know, it was weird. Like, because if they, if they otherwise displayed like some kind of bias that was really distasteful societally, you could make the choice not to buy it there. But instead, you're just giving them money to win it.
Who are you giving money? Sorry, I forgot the last one.
You don't know if they could be like racist, I guess is the argument.
Oh, okay,
you know
right.
What I'm saying? Like, it's kind of like hiding them in a weird way, but I don't know.
Right, so now you might now end up shopping with racist shop owners who, because you don't know that they are.
Whereas like before you could at least have the, I don't know, it was a point I'd never thought of, but it was kind of convincing.
It's almost like you're taking macroaggressions and then put them in sort of a more subtle, even more insidious way, because now they turn into microaggressions.
Yeah.
Because now the store owner can do things a little bit more subtly as far as racism is concerned.
But it's within the law.
But it's within the law because it's harder to prove and harder to legislate against. Yeah, that's always the struggle with society and racism.
All right. Is that?
Are we too far off track? Like, do you need to keep going?
It depends. If you're going to, we're pretty far off track. So if you're going to go closer to track, then by all means. But if you're going even further off track, then let's wait.
I'd say it's a little bit, so we'll just go.
Sorry?
It's kind of in the middle.
It's kind of in the middle. Okay. Well, come talk to me after class then. Okay. All right. So. Oh wait. Well, there's a little argument there that you've seen. We've talked about it. All right. On to Nozick and Cohen. Officially the final topic. If you're still with me. All right. So remember what we're doing. Just since the previous exam, we're looking at different versions of the argument by which one might try to resist or defend the idea that taxing people or redistributing property on income, so on, or people's rights just generally over objects might be required as a way of respecting their persons. Right? So there's a link, Nozick says, between what people own and between who people are. And that link, one way you might think about it is the way that Locke thinks about it, right? Which is, why is what people own a form of who people are? It's because ownership is created by labor mixing, and labor is you, and so the property has part of you in it. It's at least the standard, the popular version. So, here's the general argument, right? People own themselves. If you don't like that, some people get hung up on the idea that you might own yourself. You say, well, the rights people have over themselves are very similar to the rights of ownership. Control, exclusion, wide freedom to use as you please. Other people don't have these rights over you, right? So think about the things you can do to your car, roughly similar to the things you can do to your body, right? So you can clean it, you can move it around, you can try and maintain it properly or not so properly. Guess you can replace parts sometimes. Anyway, all these things you get to do, and others don't, not without your permission anyway. Or if they do, they wrong you. So, when people acquire stuff, I just mean like property, like land, objects, money, IDs, if IDs are going to be among the things that can be owned. They do so using their bodies or their persons. They do it by working, or they do it by mixing the labor, or by whatever you want, right? And if it's wrong for people, if people own themselves, and it's wrong to use their bodies or persons for your own purposes. It's the idea that if I jump on your back and I say, let's go for a ride, right? You're wronging you because that's your vehicle, not mine. Right? I should use my own vehicle, this one. And so then, because that's the same really as the stuff that they acquire using their own body, it's wrong to take people's stuff. And that's roughly where Nozick wants to go. And Locke gives you an argument for why this would be true. All right. Cohen doesn't want to go all the way, right? Because Cohen sees that if you accept 4, then you have to reject socialism. And Cohen is a defender of socialism, right? Because socialism does not think it's wrong to take people's stuff. Because they're all for equality, and if you have a little more than somebody else, and somebody else needs it more than you do, then it goes from you to the somebody else. Basic idea. So you have to deny 4. So Cohen has 3 options, right? Three ways he can go if he wants to deny the conclusion that it's wrong to take people's stuff, always. So he could accept, of course, this is not really a good option, but he could accept that socialism is just rampantly violating self-ownership and a terrible idea. He doesn't want to do this because he likes socialism, but it's an option, right? So not A. Here's B. This is a better option, at least for Cohen. Nozick is going to say A, of course, right? But Cohen doesn't. So here's one option that Cohen might use. B, show that there's really no connection between rights over your persons and rights over external objects, which is to reject this second premise here. Right? That's the way that many followers of Rawls these days go. They say, yeah, you have rights over yourself, but then property is purely conventional. They take Hume's theory about property being a convention, and they try to push it all the way out. Say, like, that just means you have no natural rights over stuff that's just purely created by the government, by the law, by society, or whatever. And so, yeah, you have rights over yourself, but not over the stuff. Cohen also doesn't want to do that. Cohen goes for denying premise 1 in the end. Cohen thinks, no, people do not own themselves. So self-ownership, false. As we'll see, Cohen accepts that the idea is very plausible. He thinks it's a very attractive idea. But upon reflection, when we get really down to the nitty-gritty, no. He has an eye lottery example. Does anyone remember the eye lottery? It comes up in the reading. An artificial eye lottery comes up in the reading, but it's a variation. It's supposed to show. All right, well, here's what Cohen gives. He says, yeah, I like self-ownership. You'll like self-ownership too. Here's why. He gives a thought experiment. Suppose that you really are committed truly to equality. Right? You think nobody should be worse off than anyone else through no fault of their own. Cohen actually believes that. He says, well, some people are born with 2 well-functioning eyes, like me, right? Both of these working very, very well right now. But then some people are born with only 1 well-functioning eye. That's not so bad. Some people are born with 0 well-functioning eyes. That's horrible, right? They don't see anything. And then suppose that we have a way that we can just transplant one of these, still leaving me with a pretty good eyesight, and put it in one of these people who have 0 eyes, and then move them from seeing absolutely nothing to seeing very, very well, some depth perception. But, they get 99% of the way there. And Cohen says, well, that would make the world a lot more equal. Probably would make in net sort of people, like happiness might go up as well. Would this be a good idea? No, it would be horrible, right? The eye lottery where we should have like lots, like a sort of an annual raffle or something, where like a very horrible version of bingo. Outcome, your social security number, your eye, you have to give up 1 eye for this blind person. Horrible idea, thinks Cohen. Why? Well, because it violates this premise 1 here, right? The eye lottery is a terrible idea because other people do not have a claim over your eyes, even if you have 2 of them, or your kidneys, if you think about kidneys. Cohen uses eyes.
Like skin grafts, you can think of anything.
Right.
It's freaky.
Yeah, kidneys, skin grafts. You could take. I think they're not too far off there, where they can lop off parts of your liver and then in a petri dish grow it into a full functioning liver, and then you could transplant. That's. No liver means you die, so.
So Cohen agrees or disagrees that people are self-owners?
Well, no, he disagrees, but he starts out by saying, like, this is something we should take very seriously. And so in the reading, you'll see he comes back towards the end. In the reading, he says, actually, premise 1 is false. We are not self-owners. But what about the eye lottery? Right? And then he goes back and he has an argument for why he thinks the eye lottery is. He can still say the eye lottery would be wrong.
So he argues against law canon
Against luck and what?
And himself.
No, well, he thinks people don't own themselves, but he thinks ultimately the iLottery would still be wrong, but for a different reason. It's not because you own yourself. There is a professor at Oxford University right now called Cécile Fabre, who thinks that under some version the iLottery is okay. So philosophers will never stop saying crazy shit, I guess. But yeah, she has a book on it, like Whose Body Is It Anyway? It came out about 10 years ago.
So I guess it's sort of
Kidneys is more is like the iLottery, because I don't think we can actually transplant.
that sort of.
Maybe, yeah. And I don't think I'm not sure we can actually transplant eyes successfully. We can transplant retinas, but yeah, kidneys, she definitely thinks. She thinks that definitely we should do it with dead people. So like dead people, like cadaverous organs, we should pretty much harvest them and then use them to redistribute for people who are having. Then she thinks, well, what's the difference between a dead person and a live person? It's not in terms of their own self-ownership, not much, right? And so if you accept the second, then she thinks you should really accept the first too. So.
It's just like a black kid that we just filmed. All right. So I guess with Cohen and him and the iLottery, I'll be very succinct. I guess it's sort of like how utilitarians will defend practice utilitarianism versus act utilitarianism. It's sort of like, yeah, okay, there's a certain sort of utility you get from just doing things a certain way because it could prevent other effects. And I guess Cohen is sort of going in that vein versus, okay, self-ownership can still be wrong without the iLottery being acceptable, if that makes any sense.
Yes, exactly. That last bit made it right. Yeah. So he thinks self-ownership definitely the wrong idea, but if you reject self-ownership, you're not committed to accepting the iLottery. Right. Now Fabre thinks actually you should accept the iLottery if it was doable and so on. If it wasn't that dangerous, wasn't a slippery slope, but just basically you don't have a right over your own kidneys or your yeah. Some people's objections are other people's conclusions, you know. So. All right. Anyway, Cohen doesn't want to do that. Cohen is against the iLottery. Cohen clearly also doesn't want to go A, right? And he also doesn't want to do B. So he wants to reject self-ownership, but he accepts self-ownership as a very plausible idea because it seems to be necessary to explain why the iLottery would be wrong. And then his move in the end is he says, no, self-ownership is wrong, but I have another way to explain why the iLottery is also wrong. And just turns out autonomy is what he's about. All right. We've got 20 minutes.
I still don't think I understand what the difference is between like self-ownership and autonomy in that regard. Like I still don't really see how he gets around it, I guess. Maybe I'm just missing.
We'll get to that.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll get to that. I mean, what he wants ultimately, the short version is this. He thinks the self-ownership thesis is a very strong thesis, right? Like it means like you own yourself, which means you have full rights of exclusion towards others. And if you have full rights of exclusion, that means nobody has a right to your body or your time or your energy or your efforts. That's a really radical claim in some ways, right? Slightly annoying, but here's the standard example since Peter Singer is this. Like you walk past like there's a pond, kid is drowning in the pond. You can just step in and save the kid. Like, should you, right? Everyone thinks, yeah, you should, right? Now the question really is, are you required to, right? Morally speaking. And if you say yes, you're morally required to, like there is an obligation on you that such that there's a claim towards you, then you're denying self-ownership. Because self-ownership says you have full rights of exclusion. So if you want to tell the kid you don't get to use this body to get out of that pond, then so be it, right? So Cohen wants to back away from that. He wants to say, no, look, that cannot be right. But does that mean now I have to start accepting iLotteries? Right? And then he says, no, I have a different version, and that's autonomy, and I can get autonomy without iLotteries, but with rescues of kids. So, by the way, if you start rescuing kids, Cohen things, right, you have to recognize that you should generally just serve or help the needy. It's not just this one kid, right? There's lots of people who need your help, and If you're not a self-owner, then you owe it to the little kid, but you also owe it to the other people to help. So.
But you can still be a self-owner and do all the good stuff.
Right. So I know, like Mac, for example, Mac defends self-ownership. He thinks there's no moral requirement to you to do this. And he says, yeah, I would. Obviously, I would. He says anyone worth their salt would. And anyone worth their salt would recognize that there are plenty of good reasons for doing this.
Besides obligation.
Right. It's just like, but do they have a claim on you to do so? No. Right? So.
I'm gonna ask the question, but if
Okay.
so, in the example of, I feel bad because I should know the term for it, but I don't know the term for it. Where like a person decides to end their life, like let's say you're on like life support.
Euthanasia.
Yeah. How would Cohen feel about that? Because I feel like that's a really strong point of self-ownership.
Right.
So, how, if he thinks that people are not self-owners, how would he feel about that?
I'm not sure. Yeah, so I agree that self-ownership theorists would find that a fairly easy case. Right? So euthanasia is cases in which you don't kill yourself, but you have someone else kill you on your behalf, a physician. And so self-owners think, yeah, that's okay, because
It's like two consenting.
right, just like you can bring your car to the dump and let it, like, put it in the car crusher and to kill the car, so to speak. Right? You can have the doctor go and kill your body too. That's your prerogative as a self-owner.
Isn't that outlawed in some places? Like,
Oh, it's outlawed almost everywhere. Yeah.
yeah, but you
It's,
can't do
yeah. Most places, assisted suicide is even outlawed, which is you killing yourself with the assistance of a physician. Some places, even suicide is outlawed, so, which is no one else. It's just you killing yourself. It's illegal. No. What are they going to do? But
that.
it is illegal. Failed attempts, they can do something.
Yeah,
Right?
that's
Yeah, I don't know what Cohen would say. One of the advantages of the self-ownership thesis is because it's such a strong claim, it's very clear around the edges, because it's maximal control. When you start backing off of that, those questions become open. So you have to start thinking very carefully about in what way does Cohen or someone like Cohen care about autonomy? What does that mean? And would that allow euthanasia or not? So there's no simple answer to that question.
What about like kind of the whole idea of like some laws being put under the religious freedom column of before gay marriage was legalized, and a lot of places would deny marriage and say it was because of the religious freedom.
Yeah. Well, quickly, because we're getting off again. So libertarians like Nozick, who believe in self-ownership, usually find these type of marriage laws obnoxious because they infringe what people can do with themselves with consenting others. So the standard libertarian line on that is usually that not just that the law should allow gay couples to get married, but that there shouldn't be any marriage laws at all. Like this is none of the government's business. These are contracts between people. Let them get, if they want to they want to go to church and the church wants to marry them, go for it. It's nobody else's business, including the government's. So that's typically how they go for that. Yeah. So, all right, Will?
So Cohen, it seems like he's making this a lot harder on himself than he needs to. Because does he actually need to deny self-ownership? Can't he just say that it's like that's not like absolute like that there's like essentially like a higher standard. So like you have like self-ownership's a thing. You can like in charge of yourself, but like as far as like the original example of like the kid drowning, you're still being required to save them. Well, can't you just say, but it's not like the highest requirement? Kind of like how we have laws, but some laws have to like submit to like the Constitution. The Constitution is just like higher. So can't you say self-ownership? Yeah, that's a thing, but there's something greater like I don't know, like like Kant would say, like, you know, like a duty to like society or whatever, or like, you know, like, I don't know, helping people in need, like a Spider-Man type deal. But can't he doesn't, I feel like he doesn't need to like absolutely like just completely deny self-ownership. I feel like he can make a much like easier argument of just saying it's a thing, but it's not like the absolute, you know, it's not like the supreme requirement.
Well, I mean, if you think that self-ownership means this full control and full rights of exclusion over your body, then any view that holds that you can be required to come to the assistance of another, whether it be like reaching in to save the kid or be taxed, right, in order to help someone else, poor people or whatever, anyone who holds that is denying self-ownership.
Well,
So, in a way, we're making it sound maybe like now that Cohen is doing something much more radical than he is doing. I mean, Cohen holds a radical view, to be sure. But the denial of self-ownership is something that lots of people want to do. So if you if you believe that there should be anything like a social safety net in society, if you believe that there should be anything like provision by the government of public goods, roads, things like that, you are denying self-ownership. Right? You do not take that seriously because you think people can be taxed, forced to contribute to things that they might not want to contribute to. And the self-ownership says, no, that's just your choice. So you don't have to go all the way to socialism, right? In order, like once you say no to this, it's an open question. Like, okay, what kind of claims do other people have on you? Maybe it's only when you walk past the pond and you don't think, well, everything else, no, right? Or maybe you go all the way with Cohen, where Cohen thinks, well, in principle, there's a requirement for you to address inequality wherever it rears its head. That's the strongest form of denying it.
yeah, I see what you're saying now. I guess I was just thinking about, you know, like just that one specific example, but then there's like 2 seconds later you brought up, well, then you would also need like, you know, if someone's like starving or something like that, or anyone
Right.
who's like poor, then it becomes like a way to draw the line kind of thing. But, yeah, okay, all right, I see what you're saying.
Okay. All right, so we probably won't get today to this. We'll do that next time. We have a whole class left to see why Cohen wants to deny self-ownership and how exactly he does it. I'll do before we finish, why Cohen does not want to go with option B. So why does Cohen not want to reject the relation between people and their property or their possessions? That is the way that most Rawlsian philosophers these days, which is most philosophers these days, go. They deny the second premise and they say, no, property is a purely conventional, legal creation that has no real moral quality. It's whatever the rules say you own is what you own. So they don't like what Locke has to say, and so they get rid of 2. But Cohen doesn't want to do this. So Cohen doesn't obviously like A, because that's just giving up on his theory, but he also doesn't want to reject B, this connection between the person and his property, or her property. And the reason is, he's a Marxist, right? And the theory is central to the Marxist theory of capitalist exploitation. We talked a little bit about this last time, but namely, there can be consensual contracts, right? Contracts between employers and employees, workers and capitalists, in a capitalist economy that are exploitative. Does anyone have an idea what do I mean by exploitative? Yeah, good. Well, for Marx, that would be enough. Yeah, but usually people think there's a little more to it than just profit making. Well, no, they are by consent, right? The employees. Yeah.
Sort of buys a little bit into Locke's theory to an extent, in which people who are working on property, this labor mixing idea, they're supposed to be the ones that own the property. But at the end of the day, they're working for these companies who they're doing their labor mixing, but they never really ascertain the profits from that labor mixing. It's supposedly, according to Marx's theory, the business owner or the job creator, as is known in everyday vernacular. So that's what he means by exploiting. It's exploiting their labor, but they're not really receiving the proper profits.
Right, exactly. Yes, the last way you put it is exactly right. So it's exploitative because the employer makes a profit, gets paid, like becomes rich, not just by people working for him or her, but by people working for him or her and the employer not paying them what they would properly deserve or be entitled to being paid. So in some ways, according to Marx, in a capitalist economy, the worker is structurally underpaid. And so this is the exploitation part, so the capitalist or the employer is extracting from them, right? Value. So like you said, the Lockean theory, right? Where does all the value come from? It comes from labor. Marx thinks, yeah, it is labor. Because when we think about how a factory works, right? So you have a factory here. What goes in on one end is just raw materials, like iron ore, oil or something, whatever, like stuff. Pretty useless stuff, right? And then on the other end comes out a car, right? So that stuff is really cheap and not that useful. Like I don't know what to do with oil and iron ore and stuff like that. And then on the other hand will come a car. I can use that, right? And I can sell that for a lot of money. Now what happens in between, right? Well, what happens in between is that there is people working on the raw materials to transform them from raw materials, so like iron ore and oil is too easy, but like sheets of aluminium and tubs of rubber or something, right? Into a car. And so the value that gets created in the factory, the value that gets added to the original raw materials to transform it into the valuable end product is labor. Whose labor? Not the capitalist. That dude is just sitting in the office smoking cigars, right? It's the workers, right? It's the employees. They are the ones who are actually on the line putting together the car, transforming the raw materials into the car.
Assuming the workers weren't going to organize this endeavor themselves, if the capitalists paid them fairly, like relative to their labor, would it be okay for him to get a portion because he is mixing his labor insofar as he's like organizing it? You know what I mean? Like a venture capitalist kind of thing.
Well, good, yeah. If he actually puts labor into it in terms of like he's organizing the plan and like
Sure.
he is also adding something to the firm, then yeah, he can get paid in proportion to the labor that he puts in. But that's not that much, right? So you sit there, you do some planning, maybe you look at an Excel sheet or something, right? And then okay, well that's worth what? More than actually putting the car together? Probably not, right? Maybe a little more, but not the capitalist profit more.
Yeah.
Right? Not the. So the Ford Motor Company shareholders, by the way, don't do any work, right? They just sit on their shares, and usually in the retirement funds or whatever. But then, right, they just get paid. So where does that money come from? Well, that money comes from, that's the profit, right? Where does that come from? Marx says it comes from the labor that gets added to the materials by the laborers. But it's going not to the laborers, it's going to the owner or the shareholders or whoever. Right? So there's
Publicly traded companies.
not specifically, but yeah, they would have. But you can be a private owner of a company and do the same thing.
Oh yeah,
As long as you extract more.
But once you add, even if the boss wasn't being exploited, then you add the whole share.
So as soon as you have the boss, I mean, the boss might make money on two grounds. The boss might make money on the basis of just getting a fair wage for the work that they put in. And then there is the profit, right? And these are two different things. The profit is what the Marxist has a problem with. Because where's the profit coming from? Well, it's extra money that you have left at the end of the day, right? Well, okay, so what do? What were my costs? My costs were the raw materials, right? This much money, right? Then I had to pay my workers this much money. So those were my costs. And in the end, is the profit is what I spent, what I got for the car that came out in the other end. This much, right? And so the difference is my profit.
If the profit split evenly amongst everyone, would that be like okay by them, sort of, more or less?
Yeah. So ultimately all the workers have a right to. Because the difference is like, why do I get this difference? It's because the car is valuable to this extent. So let me write it down. Right? So here are my costs, right? And so the cost is like this much is raw materials, and this is wages that I pay, right, to my workers. And then here, this is my revenue, right? This is the income that I'm having. And then here's my profit, right? This is the way, these are all my costs I have to pay. So here's my profit. This is what I make if I'm the capitalist. The worker doesn't make that, I make that, right? But where is this coming from, this profit? Well, says the Marxist, it's the difference between the cost and the revenue. The cost is the value that got added to, the wages are the value that got added to the raw materials. So really, this is like what it cost me, the employer, to get all the value. Well, what is the value? This is the value, right? Because this is what I'm getting for it. This is what they made out of those raw materials, the price. So let's say if the difference is $100, then I'm extracting from the workers $100 more than I'm paying them. Right? Them and the people who sold me the raw materials. And that's your exploitation. Right? Like I make a profit by not paying the workers the full value of what they added to it. In that factory, crummy raw materials went in, something really valuable came out, and then in the end I'm sucking out money, which means that something got added in that factory that I'm not paying for. That's the profit. So, okay, here's like a simple argument. So if two parties exchange and neither side makes a profit, then both parties to the exchange must have given up things of equal value. Right? You might think about this. If I'm an employer and you're a worker and you add $10 worth of value to my company and I pay you $10 at the end of the day, then I'm better off $10 and worse off $10, which is zero, right? I break even. And you gave up $10 worth of labor and you got $10 in exchange, so you break even zero. So both of us don't make a profit in this case because we break even at the end of the day. Because we give up things of equal value. That, by the way, Marx thinks would be fair. Right? A fair trade is people giving up things of equal value. Now, under capitalism, employers make a profit by hiring workers, so it must be the case that they don't give up things of equal value. So the wages are lower than the value of the labor. So the profit arises from the difference between the value of the worker's labor and the value of their wage. So therefore, the value of the labor must be larger than the value of the wage. That's that little drawing there. If an employer profits by paying workers less than the full value of the labor, then they're exploiting their workers. That's just the definition of exploiting. And then follows that capitalism employers exploit their workers. All right. And here's the drawing. A little better than this maybe. So if you have a non-profit exchange, then you give me a certain value V, and I give you a certain value V in exchange, right? The same value, equal value. In a capitalist exchange, so Marx says, the employer gives the worker a wage, which is some value V minus the profit, right? The wage is lower than the total value V that the worker gives to the employer. So P is greater than 0, they make a profit. Right? So if P is greater than 0 and the wage is whatever the value the worker gives to the employer minus the profit, then it must be it's necessarily true, right, that, wait, the other way around. This thing should be flipped. The wage is smaller than the value. Couldn't be the other. The sign should be flipped. I'll change that before I upload it. All right. Here's the point that matters, and we'll stop on this. This is the idea of exploitation, right? So the idea of exploitation is the worker gives value to the employer through the labor that they perform in the factory, and the employer gives value to the worker through the wage, but the wage necessarily is smaller than the value of the labor, and that's the exploitation. The worker is not fully compensated. Why would the worker put up with this, you might ask? Well, Marx says because there's lots and lots of workers and few capitalists, and so they play them off against each other. There's a reserve army of workers, he says. So every worker comes into the capitalist office. Capitalist says, how about you work for $5 an hour? Right? You say, oh, it's a horrible job. He says, all right, go out, go find someone else. I've got 100 people lined up out of the door who will work for $5 an hour. You go to your next employee, he says, how about $5 an hour? You do this a couple times, after a while you say, oh, I guess $5, I'll take it. Right? There's plenty. So he thinks that the deck is stacked against the workers. The employer has all the power in the negotiation. The employee doesn't. You might think, well, I should hold out as a worker, so I'll wait long enough until they come. But you know what? You don't have much money as a worker, and the employer, the capitalist, he has a lot of money. He's sitting in his big residence. So he can wait out much longer than you can. You get desperate before he does. You'll take it before you know it. So that's why they accept this, but that just shows that consent doesn't remove the injustice. Right? All right. Cohen believes in a version like this, right? Something where he wants to at least hold. This is the very rudimentary. There are more sophisticated ideas these days about capitalist exploitation, but that's roughly the picture. If you think this is wrong, right, this exploitation, you have to hold that the worker somehow has a claim to the full value V of the labor that they put into the factory, right? Because if the wage is smaller than the value of the labor, and you're a Marxist, you want to say that's wrong, right? Well, why would it be wrong? Only if the worker has a right over this. If they don't have any right over the work that they perform, then you can pay whatever you want, right? So Cohen wants to say that. So he wants to say that the worker has a claim to his labor, but that was premise 2 of the previous argument. That's the Lockean theory, right? So Cohen says, look, that's really plausible. So I'm going to go tell you that self-ownership is false. All right. We'll get back to this next week.